You walked past it this morning. You'll walk past it again tonight. And like everyone else who has passed it for the last 100 years, you won't see it. Not because it is hidden, but because no one ever taught you how to look. Think about the last time you left your home, the route you take to work, to the store, to wherever the day pulls you. You know it so well that your feet could carry you there with your eyes closed. The coffee shop on the corner with its familiar smell drifting through the cracked door. The old bank building with its stone facade, columns darkened by decades of exhaust and rain. The subway entrance where the tiles have worn smooth under a million footsteps. These landmarks have become invisible through repetition. They exist at the edge of your attention, shapes your mind has long since categorized and dismissed. But what if I told you that within those few blocks, the same blocks you've walked 1,000 times, there are messages waiting to be read, symbols carved into stone that predate the buildings they now adorn, street names that tell stories completely different from the neighborhoods they label, windows bricked over not for renovation, but to hide rooms that official records claim never existed. This is the invisible layer. It exists in every city, every town, every suburb where humans have lived long enough to forget what came before. It is embedded in the physical world like watermarks pressed into old paper, visible only when you hold it up to the light at just the right angle. And the strange truth is, it is not hiding. It never was. It sits in plain sight, patient as stone, waiting for someone to finally notice. Most people never do. Not because they lack intelligence or curiosity, but because modern life has trained us to look past our surroundings rather than into them. We optimize for speed. We move through spaces without inhabiting them. The city becomes a blur of familiar shapes, a backdrop to the thoughts running through our heads or the screens glowing in our hands. But every now and then, someone breaks the pattern. Someone glances up at the wrong moment, or perhaps the right one. They notice a carving above a doorway that seems out of place. They wonder why a street named after a saint runs through a district that was never religious. They pause at a building and realize that its windows don't match its floors, as if the structure is lying about its own interior, and once they see it, they cannot unsee it. But what happens when someone does stop? When someone finally looks up? Your brain is lying to you. Every single day, it erases entire buildings from your consciousness. Not because they aren't there, but because it has decided you don't need to see them. This isn't a metaphor. It is a documented phenomenon that scientists call inattentional blindness. In one famous experiment, researchers asked participants to watch a video of people passing a basketball and count the number of passes. Halfway through the video, a person in a gorilla suit walked directly into the center of the frame, beat their chest, and walked off. When asked afterward, nearly half the participants had no memory of the gorilla. They hadn't looked away. They hadn't blinked. Their eyes had absorbed every pixel of light, but their brains, focused on counting passes, had simply edited the gorilla out of existence. This is what your mind does every moment of every day. It takes the overwhelming flood of sensory information pouring through your eyes and decides, without asking you, what matters and what doesn't. The result is a carefully curated reality, a highlight reel stripped of anything your brain considers noise. For our ancestors, this was survival. A hunter tracking prey couldn't afford to notice every leaf and shadow. A mother watching her children needed to filter out the ordinary to detect the threat. The brain evolved to prioritize, to ignore the familiar in favor of the new, the dangerous, the useful. But something unexpected happened when humans built cities. We surrounded ourselves with layers upon layers of history, architecture, and meaning, and then our ancient brains did exactly what they were designed to do. They filtered it out. The carved symbol above the doorway became invisible because it posed no threat. The street name written in a language no one speaks anymore faded into background static. The bricked over window disappeared from conscious awareness entirely. We became masters of unseeing. Historians have a word for places like this. They call them palimpsests, manuscripts where the original text has been scraped away and written over, sometimes multiple times. But here is the secret that scribes discovered centuries ago. The old words never fully disappear. They leave impressions, shadows, traces that bleed through to the surface when the light catches them just right. Cities are palimpsests written in stone and steel. Every street corner holds layers of meaning accumulated over generations. Every building carries the ghost of what stood there before. The information isn't gone. It is simply been overwritten by the present, and your brain, in its ruthless efficiency, has learned to read only the topmost layer. But the question remains, what exactly are we missing? What stories are written on walls we pass every day? The answer begins, literally, beneath our feet. In the next 2 hours, you're going to discover that the ground you stand on has been someone's ceiling, that the walls around you have been someone's confession, and that the monuments you photograph for social media were built to make you forget something that powerful people wanted buried forever. This is not a documentary about ancient ruins in distant deserts. This is not about crumbling temples in jungles you will never visit. This is about the city you live in, or one exactly like it, because every major city on Earth is actually 2 cities existing in the same space, separated not by distance but by time and the deliberate act of forgetting. The first city is the one you know, the streets you navigate, the buildings you enter, the landmarks you use to orient yourself. This city feels solid, permanent, as if it has always existed in exactly this form. The second city is the shadow. It exists beneath the sidewalks you walk, inside the walls you lean against, encoded in the names of streets and squares that no one questions anymore. This city holds secrets that would rewrite your understanding of the ground beneath your feet. If only you knew how to access them. We are going to access them together. You will walk through underground passages that stretch for miles beneath modern capitals, cities beneath cities built by civilizations that vanished so completely that even their names have been forgotten. You will learn to read the symbols carved into buildings by secret societies whose members included presidents, kings, and revolutionaries. Some of these symbols are warnings, some are maps, some are messages intended for initiates who would not be born for another century. You will discover that the street names you pass without thinking often commemorate massacres, betrayals, and revolutions that have been deliberately scrubbed from public memory. You will see ghost signs painted on brick walls, advertisements for businesses that died generations ago, their faded letters now visible only when the light falls at certain angles. And you will stand before monuments that millions photograph every year without ever understanding their true purpose. Monuments built not to honor, but to obscure. Not to remember, but to make people forget. Consider what awaits. A church in a European capital that was constructed directly on the foundations of a pagan temple, and where rituals older than Christianity may have continued for centuries behind locked doors. A beloved department store in a major city that was built on top of a mass grave, its shoppers walking daily over bones that were never moved. A public park where families picnic on grass that grows over the ruins of an entire neighborhood, erased not by disaster but by decision. These are not legends. These are documented facts hiding in plain sight. Our journey begins in the most unexpected place, directly beneath your feet. Because before you learn to look up at what hides in the skyline, you need to understand what happens when entire worlds are deliberately buried. This documentary is going to change something in you. Not because it tells you what to think, but because once you see what has been there all along, you'll realize you've been walking through a museum without ever buying a ticket. Before we descend into the first hidden world, there is something you should understand about what follows. This is not speculation. This is not conspiracy dressed in dramatic lighting. Everything you are about to discover has been documented, studied, and in many cases publicly acknowledged, yet somehow never made its way into common knowledge. These are the facts that fell through the cracks of history textbooks, the truths too strange or inconvenient to include in the simplified stories we tell ourselves about how our cities came to be. Some of what you learn will unsettle you. There are chapters ahead that reveal how places of joy were built on foundations of sorrow, how monuments to freedom commemorate acts of erasure, how the buildings we consider most permanent were designed to make us forget something that came before. These revelations are not meant to disturb for the sake of disturbance. They are meant to complete a picture that has always been missing pieces. Other discoveries will carry a different weight, something closer to wonder. You will find beauty in the hidden geometries of architecture, poetry in the forgotten languages of street names, and a strange kind of hope in the persistence of the past. Even when powerful forces tried to bury certain truths, those truths survived. They endured in stone and symbol, waiting for eyes willing to see them. By the time we reach the end of this journey together, you will possess something more valuable than a collection of interesting facts. You will have a new way of moving through the world. The next time you walk through any city, your own or one you've never visited, something will feel different. Your eyes will catch details they once slid past. Your mind will ask questions it never thought to ask. You will become a reader of places, fluent in a language that most people never learn exists. This story unfolds like a mystery, each chapter building on the last. There will be moments when a revelation late in our journey forces you to reconsider something from the beginning. Stay patient. Stay curious. The picture will become clear. So let's begin where all good mysteries start, in the dark, below the streets, below the foundations, below everything you thought you knew about the cities humans built. Every city is a layer cake of the dead beneath the subway you rode this morning. There may be a street where someone walked to work 500 years ago, and beneath that, the floor where someone prayed 1,000 years before that. This is the secret that archaeologists understand, but that rarely reaches the rest of us. Cities are never truly demolished, they are buried. Layer by layer, century by century, the debris of human life accumulates like sediment on an ocean floor. Old streets become foundations, collapsed roofs become new ground. The homes where families laughed and grieved and grew old become nothing more than the dirt beneath a parking lot. Yet they remain compressed and forgotten, holding their shape in the darkness. Scientists have measured this process. In continuously inhabited areas, approximately 1 inch of debris accumulates every 100 years. It sounds almost insignificant until you do the math. A city occupied for 2,000 years sits on nearly 2 feet of its own past. Roads rise so gradually that no single generation notices, but over centuries, ground floors become basements, basements become cellars, and cellars become sealed chambers that no living person remembers ever existed. Rome offers the most dramatic example. The modern city sits on 7 distinct layers of previous Romes, each one built atop the ruins of the last. Walk into certain churches and you can descend through time itself. Medieval floors giving way to early Christian chapels, which rest on pagan temples, which were built over Republican-era homes, which sit on foundations so old that no one knows who laid them. The tourists taking photographs in the piazza above have no idea they are standing on a roof. Mexico City tells an even stranger story. When Spanish conquistadors conquered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, they dismantled its pyramids stone by stone and used the materials to build their own colonial city directly on top. They believed they had erased an empire, but the Aztec world refused to stay buried. Today, construction crews digging subway tunnels regularly break through into temple chambers that have waited in darkness for 5 centuries. The conquered city is still there, directly beneath the feet of millions who have forgotten it ever existed. London's underground reveals a different kind of memory. Dig beneath its streets, and you will find Roman amphitheatres where crowds once cheered for blood. You will find plague pits where bodies were stacked so hastily that lime still marks the soil. You will find the channels of rivers that once flowed through open air, but now run through Victorian brick tunnels, never seeing sunlight. Their names forgotten by everyone except historians and sewer workers. And then there are the underground cities that people can actually visit, though most never do. Seattle's original downtown still exists beneath its current streets, sealed away after a catastrophic fire and a decision to simply build over the damage rather than repair it. Edinburgh's South Bridge vaults were bricked up for nearly 200 years, becoming legend before they were rediscovered. The catacombs of Paris hold the bones of 6 million people relocated from overflowing cemeteries into tunnels that stretch farther than anyone has fully mapped. These buried worlds were created by time, disaster, and necessity. But some underground worlds weren't created by accident. Some were built deliberately and then deliberately erased from maps and memories. Seattle didn't just rebuild after its Great Fire. It buried its mistakes under 12 feet of earth and built a new city on top. Then told everyone to forget the old streets still existed, frozen in darkness just beneath the sidewalk. In 1889, the city burned. 30 blocks of wooden buildings collapsed into ash. But the fire revealed a deeper problem that Seattle's leaders had ignored for years. The city sat nearly at sea level, and its sewage system was a disaster. Toilets would explode during high tide. Streets flooded with waste after every heavy rain. So when the time came to rebuild, officials made a decision that would define the city's hidden geography forever. They didn't just construct new buildings, they raised the entire downtown by one full story. New streets were built 12 feet higher than the originals. Sidewalks became bridges suspended above the old storefronts. Residents climbed ladders to reach the new elevated walkways while businesses continued operating at the original ground level below. Eventually the gaps were filled in, the ladders removed, and the old street level was sealed away. Today, those original storefronts still exist beneath Pioneer Square. You can walk through them on guided tours, passing windows that once faced bustling avenues and now stare into walls of compressed earth. Most people walking above have no idea an entire city exists beneath their feet. London tells a similar story, though its burial happened gradually, almost secretly. The River Fleet once flowed openly through the heart of the city, wide enough to carry boats and lined with markets. The Tyburn wound past what is now Buckingham Palace. The Walbrook divided Roman London in two. These were not small streams. They shaped where roads were built, where settlements formed, where the city's first boundaries were drawn. But as London grew, these rivers became dumping grounds. They filled with sewage, animal carcasses, industrial waste. Rather than clean them, Victorian engineers simply covered them over, directing their waters through brick tunnels that still flow beneath the streets today. Fleet Street bears the name of a river that hasn't seen sunlight in 200 years. There is something deeply human about this pattern. We bury what shames us. We cover what inconveniences us. We build new surfaces over old failures and then we forget. This happens in cities, but it also happens in cultures, in histories, in families. What we cannot face, we push underground, sometimes literally, and this raises a question that lingers like cold air from an unsealed basement. If Seattle could bury an entire downtown and most residents never learn it exists, if London could erase rivers that once defined the city's shape, what else has been buried so thoroughly that we have simply forgotten to look? What lies beneath the surfaces we walk every day waiting in silence? But buried cities are just the beginning, because beneath many cities lies something even more deliberate. Networks of tunnels that were never meant to be found. There are tunnels beneath your city that don't appear on any official map. Some were built to move whiskey, some were built to move people, and some were built for reasons that have never been officially explained. Beneath the streets of Portland, Oregon, a network of passages runs through the earth like veins through a body. They are called the Shanghai Tunnels, and for decades they served a purpose that the city preferred to forget. The story goes like this. In the late 19th century, ship captains needed crew members, and they weren't particular about how they got them. Men would drink at saloons along the waterfront, and some of those men would never see daylight again. Trapdoors would open beneath their feet. They would wake in darkness, already moving through underground corridors toward the river, where ships waited to carry them across the Pacific. By the time they regained full consciousness, the shore was gone. Whether every detail of these legends is accurate remains debated, but the tunnels themselves are real. You can walk through them today, beneath businesses whose owners may not even know what lies below their floors. During Prohibition, tunnels served a different kind of secret. Across America, passages were dug beneath small towns to move illegal alcohol from hidden storerooms to speakeasies that operated behind legitimate storefronts. In Havre, Montana, an entire underground district still exists, preserved almost exactly as it was a century ago. In Moose Jaw, Canada, tunnels that once hid bootleggers now hide something stranger in local memory. Stories of Chinese immigrants who lived beneath the streets to escape racist laws that restricted where they could work and live. The underground became a shadow society, a place where the rules above did not apply. But not all tunnels were built for commerce or survival. Some Some were built for continuity of power. Beneath Washington, D.C., a network of passages connects government buildings in configurations that remain partially classified. Members of Congress can move between offices without ever stepping outside. During the Cold War, deeper systems were constructed beneath major cities, designed to shelter government officials in the event of nuclear attack. The population above would burn, but the machinery of state would survive, sealed beneath layers of concrete and lead. These bunkers still exist. Some have been decommissioned and opened to tourists. Others remain operational, their purposes updated for modern threats that officials prefer not to name. What unsettles the mind is not the existence of these tunnels, but their persistence in secrecy. City planners know they are there. Utility workers encounter them. Yet official maps remain incomplete, showing some passages while omitting others. In certain cities, there are entire sections of underground infrastructure that appear on no public document. When asked, officials offer explanations that explain nothing: security concerns, outdated surveys, administrative oversight. The tunnels exist. The maps do not show them, and no one with authority seems eager to correct the discrepancy. This is the nature of hidden spaces. They are not hidden because they are unimportant. They are hidden because someone decided they should be. And once that decision is made, it tends to outlast the people who made it. But tunnels are only useful if they lead somewhere. And in many cases, they lead to places that were deliberately designed to be forgotten, not underground, but hidden in the structures that still stand above. When workers began renovating an ordinary office building in London, they broke through a wall and found themselves standing in the 1500s. A perfectly preserved Tudor room that no one had entered in 400 years. The discovery was accidental. The renovation crew expected to find standard interior walls, the typical layers of drywall and plaster that accumulate over decades of office modifications. Instead, their sledgehammers revealed oak paneling, original plasterwork, and a ceiling painted with Tudor roses and heraldic symbols. The room had been sealed, perhaps deliberately, when the building was modernized in the Victorian era. Someone had simply built a new wall a few feet in front of the old one, creating a hidden cavity that preserved everything inside. This pattern repeats throughout older cities. Buildings aren't demolished. They're wrapped in newer buildings like Russian nesting dolls. Churches built around older churches preserve pagan altars and medieval chapels within their walls. The current structure protects what came before, sometimes intentionally, often through simple inertia. It is easier and cheaper to build around existing foundations than to demolish completely and start fresh. London's Church of St. Martin in the Fields has an 11th century chapel hidden inside its 18th century Georgian architecture. The medieval structure remains intact beneath later additions, accessible through passages that most visitors never see. The older chapel serves as a crypt now, its original purpose forgotten by everyone, except architectural historians who know where to look. Storefronts conceal earlier iterations beneath their modern facades. A shop that looks like it dates from the 1970s might have a Victorian storefront hidden behind a layer of aluminum siding and plastic signage. Renovators discover these earlier versions when they strip away decades of improvements. Sometimes the original lettering is still visible beneath the paint. Ghost signs from businesses that closed generations ago, preserved accidentally by the cheap materials that covered them. The practice of facadism takes this to an extreme. Preservationists save only the front of a historic building, while developers construct something entirely new behind it. The facade becomes a mask, maintaining the appearance of historical continuity, while everything it pretends to front has been gutted and replaced. The practice reveals how societies choose what to remember. The exterior matters. It is what people see, what maintains the street's character. The interior is expendable. The Bank of England sits on top of a Roman temple to Mithras. When construction crews excavated for the bank's foundations in the 19th century, they found temple remains buried beneath what had been London street level. The temple was partially preserved, incorporated into the bank's lower levels, where almost no one sees it. A pagan religious site now serves as a curiosity in the basement of one of the world's most important financial institutions. These survivals tell us that architectural history doesn't follow a clean chronological line. Old and new coexist in layers, sometimes separated by centuries but only by inches of wall. The 1500s sits behind drywall. The 11th century hides inside the 18th. The past isn't distant, it is one renovation away. These hidden spaces tell us something profound about how humans build. We don't just construct buildings, we leave messages. And some of those messages were never meant for us. They were meant for people who would know how to read them. Every time you walk into a bank that looks like a Greek temple, you're being manipulated by a design language that is over 2,000 years old, and it still works even though no one told you what it means. Before most people could read, buildings did the talking. Architecture was not simply about shelter or function. It was a language carefully constructed to communicate power, authority, and social order to anyone who passed by. A cathedral's soaring height told peasants that God's kingdom was vast beyond comprehension. A king's palace told visitors they were small, that the person inside commanded resources beyond imagination. Every stone was chosen, every proportion calculated, every ornament designed to speak directly to the unconscious mind. And this language never disappeared. It simply became invisible to those who forgot how to read it. Consider the columns that line government buildings, banks, and universities across the Western world. These are not random aesthetic choices. The Greeks developed 3 distinct column styles, each carrying specific meaning. Doric columns are thick, sturdy, unadorned. They communicate strength, masculinity, military power. The Parthenon used Doric columns because it honored Athena as a warrior goddess. Ionic columns are thinner, more elegant, topped with scroll, like spirals. They suggest scholarship, wisdom, feminine grace. Libraries and academies favored them for precisely this reason. Corinthian columns are the most elaborate, decorated with carved acanthus leaves. They signal wealth, celebration, luxury. When the Romans built their grandest temples, they chose Corinthian. These codes traveled through centuries. When American architects designed the first major banks in the 19th century, they faced a problem. Banks were new institutions asking people to trust them with their money. There was no historical precedent for what a bank should look like. So architects reached backward, borrowing the visual language of Greek temples, buildings associated with permanence, divine protection, and timeless stability. The message was clear without ever being spoken. This institution is as trustworthy as the ancient world, as solid as marble, as enduring as civilization itself. It worked. It still works today. Courthouses followed similar logic. The blindfolded woman holding scales appears on legal buildings across the globe. She is Justitia, the Roman goddess of justice, and her image communicates that the law is impartial, balanced, and blind to status. Whether this is true matters less than whether people believe it when they climb those steps. The architecture does the persuading before any trial begins. This is the uncomfortable truth about the built environment. You are constantly receiving messages you never consciously process. The height of a ceiling affects whether you feel important or insignificant. The width of a doorway influences whether you feel welcomed or intimidated. The materials surrounding you shape your sense of permanence and trust. Architects have understood this for millennia. Most of the people walking through these spaces do not. And so we move through cities that are speaking to us constantly, responding to cues we cannot name, feeling emotions that were engineered into stone centuries before we were born. But architectural language goes far beyond columns and facades, because some builders embedded messages that were never meant to be understood by everyone, only by those who knew the code. On the stones of medieval cathedrals, hidden among the carvings of saints and gargoyles, there are signatures, personal marks left by the hands that built these monuments. Some of those marks appear in churches thousands of miles apart, carved by men who shared secrets we're still trying to understand. The practice began for practical reasons. In the 12th and 13th centuries, stonemasons were paid by the piece. Each worker needed a way to prove which stones were his, so he carved a small symbol into every block he finished. These marks were simple at first: a cross, an arrow, a geometric shape that could be cut quickly with a chisel. They were accounting tools, nothing more. But over time, they became something else entirely. Master masons developed distinctive marks that functioned like signatures. When a craftsman's reputation grew, his mark became a symbol of quality that transcended borders. Apprentices who trained under these masters would inherit elements of their teacher's mark, modifying them slightly to create their own. Generation after generation, these symbols evolved, branching like family trees carved in limestone. Scholars who study masons' marks can sometimes trace lineages of craftsmanship spanning centuries, identifying the teacher-student relationships that spread techniques across medieval Europe. At Notre Dame de Paris, researchers have catalogued hundreds of distinct marks scattered across the cathedral stones. Some appear only once. Others repeat throughout the structure, evidence of masons who spent years or even decades working on a single building. At Salisbury Cathedral in England, marks cluster in patterns that reveal how construction progressed, which teams worked on which sections, how labour was organised across the massive project. At Cologne Cathedral, whose construction spanned over 600 years, marks from different centuries sit side by side, a timeline written in symbols that most visitors never notice. But here is where the story grows more intriguing. Certain marks appear in cathedrals separated by vast distances. The same symbol carved into stone in France appears again in Germany, again in Spain, again in Scotland. This suggests movement, skilled workers travelling along networks that connected the great building projects of medieval Christendom. Cathedral construction was the largest industrial undertaking of its age, and it required specialised knowledge that only certain men possessed. These men moved where the work was, carrying their marks and their secrets with them. Some researchers believe that certain marks carry meaning beyond identification. They point to symbols that resemble later Masonic imagery, compasses, squares, interlocking triangles. They suggest that medieval guilds embedded coded messages in their work, communicating beliefs or allegiances that could not be spoken openly. Others dismiss this as projection, arguing that simple geometric shapes will inevitably resemble one another across cultures and centuries. The truth remains contested, buried in the ambiguity of marks whose makers left no explanations. What is certain is this: thousands of these signatures exist in public buildings across Europe, visible to anyone who knows to look. They are the fingerprints of forgotten craftsmen, men whose names were never recorded, but whose hands shaped monuments that have outlasted empires. Every cathedral is a collaboration across generations, signed in a language we only partially understand. But Mason's marks were just signatures, identifiers, not messages. For true coded communication embedded in architecture, we need to look at the organizations that didn't just build buildings, they built entire systems of hidden meaning. The all-seeing eye on the dollar bill isn't hidden. The Masonic square and compass on hundreds of public buildings aren't hidden. They were placed there deliberately in full view, because the builders assumed that anyone who mattered would understand exactly what they meant. There is a difference between secrecy and selective communication. The symbols embedded in architecture by Masonic lodges, religious orders, and guild organizations were never meant to be invisible. They were meant to be legible only to certain eyes. A compass and square carved above a doorway told fellow Masons that this building was designed by one of their own. An all-seeing eye declared that the architects believed in a watchful divine presence overseeing their work. A beehive represented industry and cooperation. An acacia branch symbolized immortality and resurrection. These were not conspiracies. They were conversations conducted in public using a vocabulary that most passers-by simply did not possess. Walk through the older sections of Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, or London, and you will find these symbols everywhere. They appear on courthouses, banks, libraries, and civic monuments. The men who built these cities were often Freemasons, and they saw no reason to disguise their affiliations. Membership was a mark of respectability, a signal of moral character and intellectual seriousness. They carved their symbols into stone, because they were proud of what those symbols represented. The secrecy came later, imposed by generations who forgot the meanings and filled the void with speculation. Other traditions communicated through architecture with equal sophistication. Early Christians, worshipping in secret during Roman persecution, identified safe meeting places with the ichthys, the simple fish symbol that could be drawn quickly in dust and erased before hostile eyes noticed. Islamic architects encoded mathematical and spiritual principles into geometric patterns that repeat infinitely, reflecting beliefs about the endless nature of divine creation. The intricate tilework of mosques is not merely decorative. It is theological, expressing through shape and symmetry what words cannot capture. In cities across Europe, Jewish symbols still mark buildings whose communities vanished generations ago. A carved menorah above a doorway, a Star of David worked into ironwork. These signs once indicated Jewish homes, businesses, or gathering places. Today they stand as memorials to populations erased by persecution and war. The symbols remain, but the people who understood them are gone. The buildings speak to an audience that no longer exists. This is the fragility of symbolic communication. It requires shared knowledge, maintained across generations. When that chain breaks, the symbols become puzzles rather than messages. We look at an all-seeing eye and invent stories about secret societies controlling governments. We see geometric patterns and assume they must conceal something sinister. The truth is often simpler and sadder. We have forgotten what our ancestors knew. The symbols were never hidden from us. We simply stopped learning how to read them. But symbols can be removed, defaced, or destroyed when power changes hands. Which is why some architects developed a different strategy, hiding messages not in symbols, but in the very geometry of the structures themselves. The reason certain churches make you feel small and others make you feel transcendent isn't an accident. It is geometry, mathematical relationships that have been known for millennia, encoded into stone and space to shape how you feel without you ever knowing why. There is a number that appears everywhere in nature, approximately 1.618. Mathematicians call it the golden ratio. It describes the spiral of a nautilus shell, the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, the proportions of the human face that we instinctively find beautiful. Ancient builders discovered this ratio through observation, and they believed it carried divine significance. A number that governed the growth of living things must surely reflect the mind of whatever created them. So they embedded it in their most sacred structures, hoping to channel that same creative power into walls and ceilings and doorways. The Parthenon's facade fits almost perfectly within a golden rectangle. Gothic cathedrals use proportions derived from sacred number sequences, their naves and transepts calculated to ratios that medieval builders considered reflections of cosmic order. Renaissance architects wrote treatises on divine proportion, arguing that certain measurements could make a space feel harmonious while others would create unease. They were not guessing, they were applying principles tested across generations of construction. But here the controversy begins. Modern researchers armed with measuring tools and computers have found golden ratios in buildings where none were intended. The human mind excels at finding patterns, even where patterns do not exist. Some scholars argue that ancient builders worked with simpler geometric systems and that the golden ratio appears only because we look for it so eagerly. Others counter that the consistency across cultures and centuries suggests genuine intention. The debate continues without resolution. What cannot be debated is the effect. Certain spaces calm the mind, others agitate it. Some rooms feel expansive despite modest dimensions, others feel claustrophobic despite generous square footage. Ceiling height, wall proportion, the relationship between width and depth, these variables shape human emotion in measurable ways. Researchers have documented changes in heart rate, breathing patterns, and stress hormones when subjects move between differently proportioned spaces. The geometry does something to us, whether or not we understand how. Medieval builders may not have had modern instruments, but they had centuries of accumulated observation. They knew which proportions made worshippers feel awe, and which made them feel fear. They understood that a room could prepare the mind for prayer or for obedience. This knowledge was passed from master to apprentice, encoded not in written texts, but in the buildings themselves. Every cathedral was a lesson for those who would build the next one. Geometry shapes how we feel in a space. But it is the faces, the carved figures looking down at us from high places, that were designed to shape how we behave. The faces on medieval buildings aren't just decorative. Some are portraits of real people, but we've lost their names. They watch the streets below with expressions of mockery, sorrow, and warning, and we walk past them without ever looking up to meet their gaze. First, a distinction that most people never learn. A gargoyle is a water spout, a functional element designed to direct rainwater away from walls and foundations. The word comes from the French gargoylade, meaning throat. Water flows through the figure and out its mouth, protecting the stonework below from erosion. A grotesque, by contrast, serves no practical function. It simply watches. Both categories appear on medieval buildings in staggering variety, but they are not the same thing. The gargoyle works. The grotesque observes. Together they form a population of stone beings that most pedestrians never notice. Demons crouch at roof edges, their faces twisted in expressions of malice or mischief. Angels spread wings that have weathered centuries of rain and wind. Animals real and imagined, lions, eagles, dragons, creatures that combine features of several beasts, perch on cornices and buttresses. And then there are the human faces, often the most unsettling of all. Some appear to scream, others laugh. Still, others wear expressions of profound sadness, staring out at cities that have transformed beyond recognition since the stone was carved. Why did medieval builders populate their structures with such figures? The answers are multiple and layered. Practically, gargoyles solved a drainage problem with artistic flair. Spiritually, grotesques were believed to ward off evil fighting fire with fire by placing monstrous guardians on sacred buildings. For populations that could not read, these figures taught religious lessons. A demon being crushed beneath an angel's foot communicated the triumph of good over evil more effectively than any sermon. And psychologically, the presence of watching faces reminded everyone below that their actions were observed. Sin had witnesses even when no human was looking. At Notre Dame de Paris, the famous chimeras added during 19th century restoration have become icons of Gothic atmosphere. The Lincoln Imp, a small carved figure in Lincoln Cathedral, has generated legends for 700 years. Locals say it was a demon turned to stone by angels. At Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, hundreds of carvings cover nearly every surface, their meanings debated by historians and conspiracy theorists alike. But look closely at certain figures and you will notice something strange. The faces are too specific, too individual to be generic representations of demons or sinners. They have crooked noses, distinctive brows, asymmetrical features that suggest real people rather than imagined monsters. Scholars believe that some medieval carvers immortalized their contemporaries in stone, perhaps patrons, perhaps rivals, perhaps people who had wronged them. A stonemason could grant a kind of immortality or condemn someone to eternal mockery, and no one would ever know for certain which faces were portraits and which were invention. They remain up there now, watching, as they have watched for centuries. But gargoyles were public figures, visible to all. Some sculptors reserved their most meaningful carvings for places no one was meant to see. Beneath the choir seats of great cathedrals, where priests knelt in prayer, medieval craftsmen carved pornography, satire, and mockery, and no one in authority ever knew it was there. In churches across Europe, choir stalls were fitted with misericords, hinged wooden seats that could be folded up to reveal small ledges where clergy could lean during long services. The underside of each seat, hidden when lowered, provided a small wooden panel that carvers decorated with astonishing freedom. These were spaces that bishops rarely inspected and congregants never saw, and so the craftsmen filled them with images that would have scandalized anyone in authority: monks caught in compromising positions, demons defeating in elaborate detail, couples engaged in acts that required no interpretation. Folk creatures from pre-Christian traditions appeared alongside biblical scenes. Local gossip was immortalized in wood. A carver's personal grudge against a particular priest might be encoded in a scene of clerical foolishness that would remain hidden for centuries. The phenomenon extends beyond misericords. In bell towers where only maintenance workers ever climbed, sculptors carved figures into corners that faced nothing but shadow behind altar screens on surfaces that would be pressed against walls forever. Craftsmen left their marks. High in the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals where no scaffold would ever return and no human eye could distinguish detail, carvers created works of remarkable precision. These pieces faced only upward toward the heavens, or perhaps toward a god who would appreciate what human patrons would not. Why invest such effort in work that would almost never be witnessed? The question has occupied scholars for generations. Some argue it was professional pride, proof of skill meant to impress fellow craftsmen who understood the difficulty of the work. Guild members inspected each other's labor, and hidden carvings demonstrated mastery regardless of visibility. Others suggest spiritual motivation, the belief that divine eyes missed nothing, but work done in secret carried equal weight to work done in public. A carving seen only by God was still a carving offered to God, but a third explanation carries weight. These hidden spaces may have been the only places where craftsmen could express themselves freely. The public faces of cathedrals were controlled by clergy, by patrons, by theological requirements. Every visible figure had to serve the institutional message, but in the shadows a different voice could speak. Resentment toward wealthy churchmen who underpaid workers, affection for folk traditions that official religion suppressed, simple human humor that found no place in solemn iconography. The hidden carvings reveal a medieval world far more irreverent, earthy, and complex than the pious surfaces suggest. These spaces were private rebellions, carved in permanent materials by hands that knew their jokes might wait centuries for an audience. Hidden carvings were one form of rebellion, but some builders expressed their dissent more publicly, if you knew where and how to look. When a medieval baron refused to pay the craftsman who built his church, they got their revenge by carving his face onto a demon that would stare down at his descendants for the next 600 years. The practice was more common than most people realize. Stonemasons possessed a peculiar power. They could grant immortality or inflict eternal humiliation. And unless their subjects studied every carved figure on a building, they might never know which fate they had received. A patron who shortchanged workers might find his likeness appearing beside devils in a scene of damnation. A bishop known for hypocrisy might be immortalized with donkey ears or a pig's snout, his features just recognizable enough for locals to appreciate the joke. These were not random grotesques. They were specific portraits, carved by men who understood that stone outlasts memory. Across Europe, researchers have identified figures that appear to represent historical individuals captured in unflattering contexts. At Cologne Cathedral, certain faces among the damned bear suspicious resemblance to documented political figures of the construction era. At English parish churches, local legends identify specific gargoyles as portraits of unpopular lords or corrupt clergy. The evidence is often circumstantial. Features erode, records disappear, and certainty becomes impossible after centuries. But the pattern persists across too many buildings to dismiss as coincidence. Craftsmen used their art as weapon and judgment. The opposite phenomenon proves equally revealing. When powerful figures fell from favor, their images were sometimes removed. Blank spaces on facades mark where statues once stood before regime change demanded their rejection. Replaced heads sit awkwardly on bodies carved in different styles, evidence of hasty revisions when political winds shifted. In some cases, faces were simply chiseled away, leaving smooth voids where features once declared allegiance to powers now overthrown. The absence speaks as loudly as any portrait. This impulse has never disappeared. The 20th century saw communist statues rise across Eastern Europe, then topple when the ideology that erected them collapsed. Lenin's face watched from countless squares until crowds pulled him down. In the American South, Confederate monuments stood for generations before contemporary movements demanded their removal. Some were relocated to museums, others were destroyed. Still others remain, surrounded by ongoing controversy about what public spaces should commemorate and what they should forget. Empty plinths now occupy squares in cities around the world. Spaces where statues once stood removed but not yet replaced. They mark moments of transition, periods when societies are reconsidering whose faces deserve to watch over public life. The debates are fierce because the stakes feel permanent. Stone endures. Whoever stands in the square today may stand there for centuries, long after the arguments that placed them have been forgotten. The history of monuments is not a record of who mattered. It is a record of who controlled the narrative at specific moments in time. Every face looking down from a building represents a victory. Every empty space represents a defeat, or perhaps a correction. Faces of dissent were carved in stone. But the most radical act of historical memory isn't adding to the built environment. It is erasing what was already there. Throughout history, the most effective way to erase a people from memory hasn't been genocide. It has been architecture. Tear down their temples, rename their streets, and within 3 generations, no one remembers they existed. The practice has a name: iconoclasm. It means the destruction of images, but its scope extends far beyond pictures and statues. When Protestant reformers swept through Europe in the 16th century, they did not simply reject Catholic theology. They took hammers to the faces of saints, whitewashed murals that had glowed for centuries, melted bells, and stripped altars bare. The destruction was systematic and deliberate. Empty niches in English cathedrals still mark where statues stood before the Reformation erased them. The reformers called it purification. Those who came after called it loss. Revolutionary France applied the same logic to symbols of monarchy. Royal crests were chiseled from buildings. Fleurs de lis were erased from gates and facades. Churches were renamed temples of reason. The violence was not mindless. It was strategic. Every symbol destroyed was a statement that the old order had ended and would not return. The blank spaces left behind announced that something new had begun. The 20th century refined these techniques into industrial efficiency. Nazi administrators methodically removed Jewish symbols from European cities, Stars of David chiseled from synagogues, Hebrew letters scraped from storefronts, entire buildings demolished to eliminate evidence of communities marked for extinction. After the war, survivors returning to their neighborhoods sometimes found no trace that their people had ever lived there. The architecture itself had been made to forget. In our own century, the pattern continues. The Taliban dynamited the Buddhas of Bamiyan, giant statues that had watched over an Afghan valley for 1,500 years. The Islamic State systematically destroyed Palmyra, erasing monuments that had survived 2 millennia of conquest and change. Each act was filmed, publicized, framed as righteous cleansing. Each act made certain histories harder for future generations to access, to study, to remember. But violent destruction is only the most visible form of architectural erasure. Quieter methods achieve similar ends. Street names change when regimes fall. Buildings are reattributed to new owners, their previous purposes obscured. Symbols are removed without announcement, replaced by blank stone that reveals nothing. A traveller walking through any major city passes dozens of sites where something significant once stood, now unmarked and unremarked. The absence creates no controversy because no one remembers what is missing. This is why reading the hidden history of our environment requires attention to emptiness. The blank niche, the smoothed facade, the renamed street. These are not neutral spaces. They are evidence of decisions made by those with power to determine what would be remembered and what would be erased. The erasure of architectural heritage is obvious when it happens through violence. But what about erasure through neglect? What about the histories that were never destroyed, just forgotten? The monument you photographed on your last vacation was designed to make you feel something specific: reverence, patriotism, awe. But the story they told you about it, that was designed too. Every day, millions of people stand before monuments and absorb the official narrative without question. A bronze plaque tells them what to think. A tour guide recites the approved version. A textbook chapter reduces centuries of complexity into 3 tidy paragraphs. And slowly, imperceptibly, the real story disappears beneath layers of simplification and careful omission. Consider the Washington Monument. Ask anyone what it represents, and they'll tell you the same thing: a tribute to the first president, a symbol of American ideals, a landmark of national unity. The tour guides will tell you it took decades to complete. They'll mention the change in marble color halfway up where construction paused during the Civil War. They'll point out that it is the tallest stone structure in the world. What they won't tell you is why it almost didn't get built at all. The monument's design was controversial from the beginning. The original plan included a circular colonnade at the base, featuring statues of Revolutionary War heroes and signers of the Declaration of Independence. But political factions couldn't agree on who deserved inclusion. Southern states wanted their heroes honored. Northern states refused. The debates grew so bitter that construction stalled for nearly 25 years. When work finally resumed, the colonnade was quietly abandoned. Too divisive. Too honest about the fractures already forming in the young nation. Then there is the question of funding. The official story suggests patriotic citizens donated generously to honor their founding father. The reality is messier. Donations dried up repeatedly. The monument became a joke in political circles, a half-finished stump mocked in newspapers. Congress refused to allocate funds for years because representatives saw it as a regional project rather than a national one. When money finally came, it came with conditions and compromises that shaped not just the monument's appearance, but its meaning. The audience the monument was designed for isn't you. It was designed for a specific moment in history when the nation needed a symbol of unity it didn't actually possess. The simplicity of its final form, a clean obelisk, stripped of all the controversial details, isn't elegant minimalism, it is erasure. Every element that might have told the complicated truth was removed, leaving only an ambiguous shaft of stone that could mean whatever the viewer needed it to mean. This is how official stories work. They flatten, they sanitize, they transform messy human conflicts into comfortable myths. And they succeed because most of us never think to look beyond the plaque, to dig through the contemporary newspapers, to examine the architectural proposals that were rejected. The hidden truth isn't hidden at all. It is sitting in archives and historical records, waiting. It is hidden only because no one bothered to look. Every monument has at least two stories, the one that is told and the one that is buried. The question isn't whether the buried story exists. The question is why someone wanted it buried in the first place. Official stories simplify, but some monuments carry messages that were deliberately designed to be invisible to most viewers, visible only to specific audiences. For over a century, secret messages may have been hung in plain sight, not as encrypted texts, but as quilts, patterns that guided enslaved people to freedom, visible to everyone, understood by almost no one. The theory sounds almost too elegant to be true. Certain quilt patterns hung on fences or windowsills supposedly served as coded signals along the Underground Railroad. A bear's paw pattern meant to follow animal trails through the mountains. A crossroads design indicated an actual crossroads ahead where a decision must be made. A tumbling blocks pattern suggested it was time to pack and prepare for the journey. The quilts were domestic objects unremarkable to anyone passing by, but to those who knew how to read them, they were maps, warnings, and promises of sanctuary. Scholars debate the historical evidence for this interpretation. Some argue the oral traditions are compelling but difficult to verify through written records, precisely because enslaved people couldn't risk documenting their escape routes. Others point out that the absence of contemporary written evidence doesn't mean the practice didn't exist. It means the system worked. The messages remained invisible to those who might have stopped them. This is the nature of double meanings. They operate in layers. The surface message satisfies official scrutiny, while the deeper message circulates among those who share the code. Churches understood this principle well. In communities under oppression, congregations built sanctuaries that spoke two languages simultaneously. The stained glass might depict biblical scenes acceptable to colonial authorities, but the specific saints chosen, the colours used, the positioning of figures, all carried secondary meanings. A church in an Irish village might prominently display a cross and conventional religious imagery for British inspectors, while incorporating subtle Celtic patterns that invoked Christian resistance traditions. The building passed inspection, the community received its message. Irish nationalist monuments perfected this dual language approach. A statue erected to commemorate a historical battle might officially honor soldiers who fought in a conflict acceptable to British rule. But the date chosen for the unveiling, the specific phrasing on the plaque, the symbolic objects placed in the statue's hands, all pointed to revolutionary figures and forbidden causes. Authorities saw a history lesson, the community saw a call to action. This pattern repeated across marginalized communities throughout history. When official maps erased your presence, you found other ways to mark the landscape. A seemingly innocuous street name might honor a resistance leader using only initials that outsiders wouldn't recognize. A building's cornerstone might bear symbols that meant nothing to city planners but everything to the people who built it. A garden layout in a segregated neighborhood might encode the names of lynching victims in the placement of memorial plants, creating living monuments that hostile authorities couldn't tear down without seeming arbitrary. The genius of these double meanings wasn't just in their creation, it was in their selectivity. The ability to read them marked you as belonging. You either understood or you didn't. And if you didn't, you would walk right past these messages without ever knowing they existed. The invisibility to outsiders wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the entire point. Communities passed these reading skills from generation to generation, sometimes through explicit teaching, often through osmosis. You learned to see what others missed. You learned which patterns mattered, which dates carried weight, which seemingly random choices were actually deliberate acts of remembrance. Double meanings protected some communities. But other histories weren't hidden through codes. They were hidden through something more effective, selective memory. The beautiful building you're standing in was almost certainly built by hands that were never acknowledged. The park you're sitting in may have witnessed events that were deliberately scrubbed from local memory. This isn't conspiracy. This is how history actually works. Consider the university campus, where students walk between classes, admiring colonial architecture and manicured lawns. The buildings are named after founders and benefactors, their achievements carved into stone. What the plaques don't mention is who actually laid those stones, who cleared the land, who constructed the walls. At many prestigious American universities, the answer is documented in financial records that nobody bothered to hide: enslaved workers. The labor was purchased, recorded in ledgers, accounted for in construction budgets. The workers had names. Those names appear nowhere on campus. This isn't a gap in the historical record. The information exists. University archivists can show you the receipts. What is missing is the willingness to incorporate this truth into the official story the institution tells about itself. It is easier to focus on academic traditions and architectural beauty than to acknowledge that the foundation of the institution rests on forced labor. Walk through certain southern towns and you'll find picturesque squares surrounded by antebellum homes. Tour guides will tell you about Civil War battles fought nearby, about famous residents who walked these streets, about the architectural details that make the buildings historically significant. What they won't mention is that within living memory, some of these squares served as lynching sites. Newspaper archives document the events. Photographs exist. Local residents who are now elderly remember being told about these gatherings by their parents. But the tourist brochure says nothing. The historical marker focuses on earlier, safer history. Plantations now operate as wedding venues and bed and breakfasts. The marketing emphasizes romantic southern charm, carefully preserved gardens, and authentic period architecture. Some acknowledge slavery in small print or brief exhibit spaces. Most emphasize the main house, the owner's experience, while the slave quarters, if preserved at all, sit at the edge of the property like an uncomfortable footnote. The full story exists in plantation records, diaries, and account books. Historians have documented everything, but the business model requires presenting the past as aesthetically pleasing rather than historically complete. Famous landmarks built by immigrant labor follow a similar pattern. A beloved bridge, an iconic monument, a celebrated piece of infrastructure. The official history praises the engineering achievement and the visionary designers. Construction workers are mentioned vaguely, if at all, but contemporary newspapers documented the reality. Workers who died during construction due to unsafe conditions. Immigrant laborers paid a fraction of what they were promised. Burial sites near the construction zone that were paved over when the project expanded. The documentation exists. The graves are still there beneath parking lots and access roads. Nobody mentions them during the dedication ceremonies. This pattern isn't the result of elaborate cover-ups. It is the natural outcome of institutional incentives. Universities benefit from presenting themselves as bastions of Enlightenment values. Tourism boards profit from comfortable heritage narratives. Landmark foundations need donors who want to feel good about preservation efforts. Acknowledging uncomfortable truths complicates fundraising and marketing. So institutions emphasize the palatable aspects of history and allow the rest to fade through benign neglect. The information hasn't been destroyed. It is being ignored. The difference matters because it means recovery is possible. Discovering these histories doesn't require leaked documents or investigative journalism. It requires looking at the materials that were always there, the account books, the newspaper archives, the construction records, and asking why certain details never made it into the official story. Inconvenient histories are hidden through silence. But some of the most important hidden truths are encoded in something most people walk past without a second glance. Names. Every street name is a political decision. Somewhere, someone chose to honor one person, one event, one idea, and in doing so, chose not to honor everything else. The names of your neighborhood are a map of who had power, and when walk through any city, and you're walking through layers of political memory, King Street, Queen Avenue, Crown Boulevard, these aren't neutral designations. They're declarations of loyalty, frozen in time long after the monarchs they honored are forgotten. Washington Street, Lincoln Avenue, Kennedy Boulevard. Each name marks a moment when certain leaders mattered enough to claim permanent space in the urban landscape. But notice what is missing. Notice who never got streets named after them. In many American cities, you'll find streets with indigenous names: Choctaw Road, Seminole Avenue, Apache Trail. These names often mark territories where those peoples no longer live. The street names are tombstones, preserving the memory of displacement in the very neighborhoods built on that displacement. The irony is rarely acknowledged. Residents drive down Pequot Lane without knowing the Pequot people were nearly exterminated in wars that cleared the land for settlement. The name remains, the people don't. Some neighborhoods carry names that puzzle contemporary residents because the history they reference has completely disappeared. A street called Brewery Row in an area with no breweries. Little Italy in a neighborhood where Italians haven't lived for generations. These names are fossils, evidence of communities that were priced out, pushed out, or simply died out. The linguistic residue outlasts the living presence. Then there are the deliberate erasures. Neighborhoods renamed to attract investment, to distance themselves from unwanted associations. Streets bearing the names of Confederate generals quietly rechristened. Avenues honoring labor leaders gradually replaced with more neutral designations. The old names disappear from maps, but persist in the memories of long-time residents, creating parallel geographies, what the place is called officially and what people who remember still call it. You can read these histories without special access or expert knowledge. Look for patterns in how streets are organized. Numbered streets typically indicate newer development or systematic planning. Named streets often follow hierarchies. Presidents first, then war heroes, then local notables, then generic nature terms when the important names run out. Check historical maps available at local libraries. Compare street names across decades. Notice when clusters of names change simultaneously, suggesting coordinated rebranding efforts. Etymology reveals stories too. A street called Boundary Road once marked a legal or social boundary. Between jurisdictions, between neighborhoods, between permitted and forbidden zones. Boulevard often indicates a street built on filled-in fortifications. Names ending in gate frequently marked actual gates in city walls that no longer exist. Street names are linguistic architecture. They structure how we understand space, guide how we navigate, shape what we remember and what we forget. The names feel permanent, natural, inevitable. But every one was chosen. Every choice reflects the priorities and power structures of a specific moment. And every name that was chosen means 100 other possible names were rejected. Names mark the living and the powerful, but the most eloquent hidden messages aren't on street signs. They're on the stones that mark the dead. Every gravestone tells a story, but you have to know the language. That carved anchor doesn't mean the person liked boats. That broken flower doesn't mean there was a mistake. These symbols were a code, and we've lost the key. For centuries, people who couldn't read words could still read gravestones. The images carved into stone communicated everything a visitor needed to know about the deceased, who they were, what they believed, how they died, whether their community mourned them. This wasn't decoration, it was information architecture, compressed into visual symbols that transcended literacy. Walk through an old cemetery and you'll see the same images repeated across hundreds of stones. Willows with drooping branches, hourglasses with wings, hands emerging from clouds, flowers in various states of bloom and decay. Each symbol carried specific meaning within a shared vocabulary. A weeping willow marked mourning and earthly sorrow. An hourglass with wings indicated that time had flown, that life had passed quickly. A hand reaching down from stylized clouds represented divine intervention, or the deceased being called to heaven. Some symbols marked specific life circumstances. A broken column indicated life cut short, potential unfulfilled, often seen on the graves of young men. A lamb marked a child's grave, representing innocence. If you see a lamb carrying a banner or pennant, it specifically signifies a child who died in Christ, assured of salvation according to the theology of the era. An anchor could mean hope, the soul anchored in faith, or it could mark someone whose profession involved the sea. Context mattered. Other symbols on the stone clarified which meaning applied. Professional symbols were direct. A compass and square identified a Freemason. Agricultural tools marked farmers. Open books suggested scholars or religious devotion. Ships' wheels, anchors, and rope coils marked sailors and maritime workers. These weren't subtle hints. They were explicit statements of identity carved in stone. Religious symbolism varied by tradition and evolved across centuries. Early Protestant stones favored death imagery, skulls, crossbones, scythes, emphasizing mortality and the brevity of earthly life. As religious sensibilities shifted, these gave way to more hopeful symbols: angels, heavenly gates, rays of divine light. Catholic stones incorporated saints and crucifixes. Jewish stones used hands positioned for priestly blessings or broken candles representing life extinguished. You can date a gravestone by its symbolic vocabulary. Harsh mortality symbols peaked in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Sentimental Victorian imagery, clasped hands, flowers, draped urns, dominated the 19th century. Modern stones often abandon symbolic language in favor of straightforward text. The knowledge to read these symbols hasn't been secretly suppressed. It is simply fallen out of common use. Guidebooks exist. Local historical societies maintain symbol dictionaries. The code is broken, anyone can learn it. But most people walk through cemeteries seeing decoration where their ancestors saw communication, seeing random carvings where contemporaries saw condensed biographies. Cemeteries are archives that remain open when libraries close, that preserve social history in stone when paper records burn. The information is there, permanent and public. You just have to learn the language. Symbols tell us about beliefs and professions, but the real stories often hide in what the stones don't say, in the gaps, the erasures, and the spaces between the graves. Beneath the parking lot of a New York City department store, archaeologists found 15,000 bodies, enslaved Africans and poor freedmen who were buried, forgotten, and quite literally paved over when their memories became inconvenient. The African burial ground in Lower Manhattan operated from the 1600s through the late 1700s. It was the only cemetery where black New Yorkers, free or enslaved, were permitted burial. The site was enormous, occupying multiple city blocks. When it closed, the city simply built over it. Streets went in, buildings went up. For 2 centuries, thousands of people walked above thousands of graves without knowing they were there. This wasn't unusual. This was standard practice. Every city has its potter's fields, burial grounds for the poor, the unknown, the unclaimed. These cemeteries typically occupied marginal land, swamps, rocky hillsides, areas prone to flooding. When the city expanded and that marginal land suddenly became valuable, the potter's fields disappeared. Sometimes graves were relocated. More often, they were simply built over. New Yorkers discovered Hart Island, the city's largest potter's field, still contains over 1 million bodies buried in mass graves. Most have no markers, many have no records. Certain categories of people were systematically denied marked graves or proper burial. Criminals executed by the state often went into unmarked plots. Victims of epidemics were buried hastily in mass graves to prevent contagion, their individual identities lost. Suicides, according to various religious traditions, were buried in unconsecrated ground or at crossroads, liminal spaces between sacred and profane. The religiously unacceptable, those excommunicated, those of the wrong faith, those whose beliefs marked them as outsiders, found themselves relegated to cemetery peripheries or excluded entirely. Cemetery archaeology has emerged as a discipline specifically to recover these erased histories. Researchers use ground-penetrating radar to locate unmarked graves, examine soil disturbance patterns to map forgotten burial grounds, cross-reference fragmentary records with land surveys. The work is painstaking. Often, the only evidence that a cemetery existed is its absence from later maps, a blank space where something used to be. The pattern of what gets preserved and what gets erased follows predictable lines. Wealthy family plots with elaborate monuments survive because descendants have resources and incentive to maintain them. Poor graves marked only with wooden crosses decay and disappear within a generation. Enslaved people's burial grounds vanish because no one with power cared to preserve them. Epidemic victims' mass graves get paved over because their existence threatens property values. The absence of graves is evidence. It documents who a society considered worth remembering and who it considered acceptable to forget. Empty spaces in cemetery records are as revealing as the names that appear. The silence tells the story that the stones cannot. The erased were denied markers. But sometimes, the most revealing graves are the ones that do have markers. If you know how to read what they're not supposed to say. In a small town cemetery, 7 stones in a row mark children from the same family who died in the same month. No record explains what happened. No history mentions their names. The stones are the only evidence that something terrible occurred there in 1837. The dates tell the story that no newspaper preserved. March 3rd, March 7th, March 12th, March 15th, March 20th, March 24th, March 29th, 7 children between the ages of 2 and 14, gone in less than 4 weeks. The family name appears nowhere in local histories. The town records from that year are incomplete. But the stones remain, arranged in heartbreaking chronology, documenting a tragedy that official memory never recorded. This is what gravestones do. They preserve the histories that institutions ignore, the individual losses, the family catastrophes, the personal voices that never made it into formal archives. Read enough epitaphs and patterns emerge. Clusters of infant deaths in a single family reveal the brutal reality of childbirth complications before modern medicine. You'll find stones marking mothers who died days after their babies, paired graves that tell their connected story without explanation. Stones marking multiple wives of the same man document what it meant to survive repeated pregnancies in the 19th century. Some inscriptions hint at scandal through careful language. A stone that describes someone as having met an untimely end or departed this life suddenly often signals violence or suicide. Events the family couldn't ignore but couldn't explicitly name in that era's moral framework. Epitaphs that emphasize the deceased's virtue with unusual fervor sometimes suggest the community questioned that virtue during life. Immigrant sections of old cemeteries preserve information you won't find anywhere else. The stones record birth villages that no longer exist, family names that were later anglicized, original spellings that disappeared as families assimilated. An immigrant section becomes a map of diaspora. You can trace which regions of Ireland, Italy, or Eastern Europe sent people to this particular town by reading the birthplaces carved into the stones. Look at death dates in context. A cluster of stones from the same week or month indicates an epidemic, a fire, a flood, or an industrial disaster. If the deceased are all young men, consider mining accidents or war. All ages and both sexes suggest disease outbreak. The stones preserve evidence of events that local boosters preferred not to emphasize when courting new residents and investors. Family plots tell multi-generational stories. Follow a surname through several rows and you can reconstruct migration patterns, economic rise or decline, family structure changes. You'll see when families stopped having 8 or 10 children, when they moved from labourer graves to merchant class monuments, when branches of the family relocated and their stones stop appearing in that cemetery. The information is there. It requires no special access, no permissions, no fees. Cemeteries are open archives, preserving primary sources in stone while paper records crumble and digital files migrate to obsolete formats. The data is permanent and public. You just have to be willing to spend time among the dead, reading their stories in dates and names and carefully chosen words. Cemeteries preserve individual stories, but some of the most dramatic hidden histories aren't in cemeteries at all. They're embedded in the everyday landscape, visible only to those who know what they're looking at. On an ordinary street corner in an ordinary town, someone has been replacing the same small wooden cross for 40 years. No plaque explains it. No record commemorates it. Someone remembers something that happened there and refuses to let the world forget. These unofficial memorials appear wherever official memory fails. Roadside crosses mark fatal accidents at curves and intersections. Flowers refresh weekly at sites where no monument will ever stand. Graffiti murals commemorate victims of violence in neighborhoods where city councils won't approve formal markers. These memorials operate outside institutional channels because institutions either can't or won't acknowledge what happened. Drive through certain regions of the American South, and you'll occasionally find small markers at rural crossroads, handmade signs, weathered crosses, sometimes just cairns of stones. Local residents know what these mark lynching sites. No historical commission approved them. No tourism board maintains them. Families and community members place them, repair them, defend them against removal. They mark what the official landscape refuses to acknowledge. Labour history lives in similar unofficial markers. A pile of stones arranged deliberately near an old mine entrance. A tree with initials carved deep into bark, accompanied by dates from a century ago. Graffiti in abandoned factories that lists names and dates. These mark strikes that turned violent, industrial accidents that killed dozens, disasters that companies paid to suppress in the historical record. The workers' families remember, the markers persist. Immigration tragedies generate their own memorial landscape. Crosses planted in desert sandmark where migrants died crossing the border. Flowers appear regularly at detention center fences. Objects tied to border walls. Photographs, children's toys, handwritten notes create impromptu shrines that authorities periodically clear, only to have them reappear. Official channels don't commemorate these deaths. Unofficial memory insists they be marked. Sometimes these memorials are architectural. Families paint murals on buildings to honor killed relatives. Residents modify public spaces with small permanent changes. A bench with an engraved name, a tree planted in specific memory, bricks added to walls bearing inscriptions. These modifications blur the line between vandalism and commemoration. They're unauthorized but tolerated, creating a layered landscape where official and unofficial memory coexist. The tension between these forms of memory is revealing. When communities feel compelled to create their own markers, it indicates that official institutions have failed them, either through indifference, suppression, or inability to act. When these markers are removed, it tells you who holds power over public space. When they persist for decades despite official disapproval, it tells you about community determination and the limits of institutional control. Reading the landscape requires attention to both kinds of markers. The official monuments tell you what powerful institutions chose to remember. The unofficial markers tell you what communities refuse to forget. The gap between them maps the territory of contested memory. Memorials mark what people choose to remember. But sometimes the most important evidence of the past isn't deliberate at all. It is accidental, preserved not because someone intended to save it, but because no one bothered to destroy it. On the brick wall of an ordinary building, you can still read an advertisement for a business that closed in 1923, painted by a hand that has been dead for nearly a century, preserved by nothing more than the quality of the paint and the accident of no one bothering to remove it. These are ghost signs. Before billboards, before digital displays, before any form of removable advertising, businesses painted their messages directly onto brick walls. The advertisements were enormous, covering entire building sides, visible from blocks away. They promoted products, announced services, declared prices, and then, eventually, the businesses closed. The products disappeared from shelves. The prices became laughable, but the signs remained, fading slowly, becoming part of the architecture they were painted on. They survived through a combination of durability and neglect. Lead-based paints, standard before environmental regulations, proved remarkably resistant to weather and time. The toxicity that makes them dangerous also makes them permanent. Many ghost signs were covered by newer advertisements or building renovations that inadvertently protected them from direct exposure. Decades later, when those coverings peeled away or buildings were demolished adjacent to them, the original signs emerged, faded but legible, like messages from another era. Walk through older neighborhoods in any major city and you'll find them. Coca-Cola signs appear everywhere, testament to the company's century-long dominance and aggressive advertising. But look closer and you'll find local businesses that were once household names in their communities. Bakeries that supplied entire neighborhoods, breweries that operated before Prohibition, shut them down, department stores that anchored commercial districts. Their signs remain after every trace of their operation has vanished. The signs serve as accidental time capsules, an advertisement for typewriter repair, a sign promoting coal delivery service with a telephone number that is only 5 digits long, shoe repair shops, hat shops, corset manufacturers, industries that have either disappeared or contracted to near invisibility. The signs document what people needed, what they bought, how they lived. You can date ghost signs through visual archaeology. Typography reveals era. Art Deco lettering suggests the 20s and 30s. Bold sans, serif fonts indicate the 40s and 50s. Psychedelic styles point to the 60s. Product references narrow the timeline further. A sign advertising victory bonds dates precisely to World War II. References to specific prices help too. When a sign advertises rooms for 75 cents per night, you know you're looking at pre-depression rates. Painting techniques also indicate age. The oldest signs were hand-painted by skilled sign painters who treated each letter as a work of craftsmanship. Mid-century signs often used stencils for speed and consistency. Some ghost signs show evidence of multiple layers, one advertisement painted over another, both now visible as the top layer deteriorates, creating palimpsests of commerce. These signs were never intended to outlive the businesses they promoted. They were advertising, temporary by definition, meant to be replaced when new owners took over or when the message became obsolete. Their survival is pure accident. No one preserved them deliberately. No historical society protected them. They endured because removal required effort and expense, and because painted brick is remarkably durable when left alone. Now they document eras that left few other visual traces. Photographs from these periods are scarce, often formal and posed. Ghost signs show the everyday commercial landscape, what people saw when they walked down the street, what messages surrounded them, what products shaped their daily lives. Ghost signs preserve commercial history, but buildings preserve other kinds of scars, marks that reveal how cities changed around them. That bricked-up doorway on the second floor once opened onto a bridge that connected two buildings, a bridge torn down 80 years ago. The door is still there because it was cheaper to brick it up than to remove it. The building remembers what we've forgotten. Every old building is a document written in modifications. Walls bear the marks of everything that changed around them and within them. You just have to know what to look for. Bricked-up windows appear on buildings throughout older cities. Some were sealed to avoid window taxes, literal taxes on light that existed in Britain and elsewhere during the 18th and 19th centuries. Property owners faced a choice: pay the tax or brick up the windows. Many chose darkness. The outlines remain visible where different coloured brick fills openings in original walls. Other sealed windows indicate floor plan changes. Rooms subdivided, layouts reconfigured, windows that no longer made sense in the new arrangement, doors that open onto nothing tell stories of severed connections. A doorway on the third floor that now faces open air once led to an adjacent building, connected by bridges or enclosed walkways that have since been demolished. Ground floor doors that now open onto solid walls indicate streets that were lowered or raised, leaving the original entrance at the wrong elevation. The building adapted by creating new entrances while the old ones remained too expensive to remove, easier to simply wall off. Look for the technological scars, iron brackets protruding from building corners once held gas lamps, street lighting before electrical infrastructure. The brackets remain because removing them would damage the masonry. Holes drilled in regular patterns up building facades mark where electrical conduits were mounted on the outside before interior wiring became standard. Loading doors on upper floors, seemingly placed at random heights, indicate an era when goods were hoisted by external mechanisms. Warehouses and factories had these loading points positioned to match the height of wagon beds and later truck beds before internal elevators made ground. Level loading practical. Stone outlines on brick walls show where neighboring buildings once stood. When a building is demolished, it often leaves its ghost on the adjacent structure, a lighter section of brick protected from weathering by the lost building, staircases that climb walls and terminate in empty space, chimney flues that serviced fireplaces in rooms that no longer exist. These modifications accumulate in layers. A single building might show evidence of a dozen different eras: original construction, Victorian expansion, early 20th century modernization, mid-century commercial conversion, recent residential renovation. Each change leaves marks. Each era adds its scars to the previous ones. Learning to read these signs transforms ordinary buildings into historical texts. Every walk through an older neighborhood becomes an exercise in architectural archaeology. The evidence is everywhere, permanent and public, waiting for observers who know how to see it. Buildings remember their own changes, but sometimes they remember the changes of everything around them, preserving traces of buildings, streets, and communities that have entirely vanished. The shadow on that blank wall isn't just weathering, it is the exact outline of a building that stood there until 1967, its roofline, its windows, even its chimney, still visible, because the wall it leaned against preserved every detail like a photograph in brick. These are ghost footprints. When buildings are demolished, they often leave perfect silhouettes on adjacent structures, party walls. The shared walls between row houses or attached buildings become accidental archives. The protected section of brick or stone remains cleaner, less weathered than the surrounding wall. The outline shows everything: where floors intersected, where chimneys ran, where windows were placed, how the roof pitched. The demolished building is gone, but its shape remains, projected onto its neighbor, like a shadow frozen in time. Cities are full of these negative space clues. A street curves inexplicably around nothing, following the footprint of a building torn down a century ago. Planners never straightened the road because property lines were already established, infrastructure already built. The obstacle vanished, but the curve remains, permanently encoding the memory of what used to stand there. Property lines preserve ancient boundaries. Walk through an old city, and you'll find lot sizes that seem random. A narrow plot wedged between wider ones, an odd triangular parcel where two streets meet at an unusual angle. These shapes often reflect medieval field systems, ancient property disputes, or the footprints of structures that defined the original layout. The buildings that created these divisions are gone. The legal boundaries persist. London's street pattern preserves the footprint of Roman city walls demolished centuries ago. The roads curve and bend where the walls once stood, following a circuit established 2,000 years ago. The stones were removed for construction material. The pattern they created remains embedded in the urban fabric, dictating how traffic flows through the modern city. Broadway in New York follows a Native American trail that predates European settlement. When the Dutch and later the English imposed their grid system on Manhattan, Broadway refused to conform. It cuts diagonally across the orderly blocks because it was already there, already the established path, already where people naturally walked. The trail became a road, became an avenue, but it never straightened to match the grid imposed around it. Paris's grand boulevards, seemingly the epitome of rational urban planning, trace the boundaries of demolished medieval neighborhoods. Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann drove their wide ceremonial streets through the old city, but they followed paths of least resistance, property lines, existing thoroughfares, the outlines of districts they were destroying. The new Paris was built on the bones of the old one, and that skeletal structure still determines where the boulevards run. Every oddly shaped lot marks a demolished structure that once defined its boundaries. Every inexplicable curve in a road follows an obstacle that no longer exists. Every gap in a building line indicates where something used to stand. The city is constantly being rewritten, but traces of earlier drafts remain, not in what is present, but in the shapes of what is absent. Negative spaces preserve what was destroyed, but some of the most important traces are found inside buildings, hidden in walls, under floors, and behind the surfaces we take for granted. In the walls of old houses, builders hid shoes, not by accident, deliberately, as magical protection against evil. The practice continued into the 20th century, and every year, renovators find them and have to decide whether to remove the building's ancient guardians. Concealed shoes represent one of the most widespread yet least documented folk practices in architectural history. They've been found in buildings across Europe and North America, typically hidden near chimneys, under floors, in walls, or around doors and windows, entry points where evil spirits might intrude. The shoes are usually worn, often belonging to children. The belief, never formally written down, but passed through generations of builders, held that a worn shoe contained something of the person who wore it, enough human presence to confuse or ward off malevolent forces. This wasn't ancient superstition abandoned centuries ago. Renovators find concealed shoes in houses built in the 1900s, hidden by builders who otherwise embraced modern construction techniques and rational worldviews. The practice coexisted with electricity and indoor plumbing, suggesting that folk beliefs persisted in private action long after they disappeared from public discourse. Other deliberate concealments follow similar patterns. Dried cats mummified in walls served protective purposes. Witch bottles, glass containers filled with pins, nails, urine, and other materials were buried under thresholds or hidden in chimneys to reverse curses. Written charms, biblical verses, and prayers show up in wall cavities tucked into spaces where no one was meant to find them. These weren't decorations. They were active magical defenses maintained by people who went to church on Sunday and would have denied believing in magic if asked directly. Accidental preservation tells different stories. Wallpapers layered over wallpapers create timelines of changing tastes. You can literally peel back decades of interior decoration to see how domestic aesthetics evolved. Newspapers used as insulation preserve specific dates and headlines. Renovation crews discover events they had no reason to research documented in the material used to keep walls warm. The news was current when the paper was stuffed between studs. Now it is historical record. Workers left messages too. Pencil scrawls on beams record construction dates, crew names, jokes, complaints about pay. Some messages are deliberate, builders signing their work for an audience they knew might never see it. Others are casual notes, calculations, reminders to themselves. Occasionally, renovators find more substantial items, lunch pails that fell between floors and were deemed too difficult to retrieve, tools that slipped into wall cavities, liquor bottles hidden from supervisors and forgotten. These discoveries reveal the human presence behind construction. Buildings weren't erected by abstract forces. They were built by specific people with names, grievances, beliefs, and habits. The hidden archives document what formal records never captured: the persistence of magical thinking, the informal culture of construction work, the small losses and deliberate concealments that make up domestic life. Every old building potentially contains these stories. They wait in walls and underfloors for the renovation that will expose them. Until then, they remain preserved by accident or intention, forgotten but not gone. Hidden objects preserve individual stories, but some locations preserve something more systematic: maps of communities that were deliberately erased. Before Central Park was Central Park, it was home to over 1,600 people, a thriving community of landowners, many of them black, who were removed so that wealthy New Yorkers could have a place to walk their dogs. Within a generation, no one remembered they had existed. Seneca Village occupied the land that would become the park's western side. Established in the 1820s, it was one of the first significant communities of black property owners in Manhattan. Residents owned homes, operated businesses, attended 3 churches, and sent their children to school. By the 1850s, the village included Irish and German immigrants alongside its black founding families. It was, by all accounts, a functional neighborhood, not wealthy but stable and self-sustaining. Then the city decided it needed a park. Commissioners declared the area blighted, despite evidence to the contrary. They invoked eminent domain, seized the property, offered compensation well below market value, and demolished everything. Homes were torn down, churches were removed, graveyards were relocated. The landscape was completely re-engineered, hills leveled, ponds created, meadows planted. Within years, no physical trace of Seneca Village remained. Within decades, its existence had been erased from popular memory. This pattern repeated across American cities throughout the 20th century. Urban renewal programs systematically targeted neighborhoods that planners deemed expendable. The criteria for expendability followed predictable lines: poor communities, communities of color, immigrant neighborhoods, areas with high renter populations and low political power. The legal mechanism was consistent: declare the area blighted, invoke eminent domain, clear the land, promise development that would benefit everyone. Highway construction accelerated the process. The interstate highway system, built primarily in the 1950s and 60s, required enormous land corridors through urban centers. Planners routed highways through neighborhoods with the least political resistance. Black neighborhoods across America found themselves bisected by elevated highways that destroyed community coherence while generating noise, pollution, and physical barriers. In city after city, the pattern was identical. Thriving neighborhoods reduced to highway corridors, residents scattered, community networks dissolved. The scale was staggering. Estimates suggest that urban renewal and highway construction displaced over 1 million Americans, predominantly people of color, between 1949 and 1973 alone. Entire neighborhoods disappeared, not through gradual decline, but through deliberate policy executed with government authority and funding. The mechanisms were legal. Eminent domain allowed governments to seize private property for public use. Redlining, the practice of designating certain neighborhoods as too risky for investment, ensured these areas couldn't access capital to improve or defend themselves. Blight designations, often applied arbitrarily, provided legal justification for clearance. Property owners received compensation, but typically far below market value and insufficient to relocate to comparable housing. Renters, who made up the majority in many targeted neighborhoods, received nothing. The irony is that many cleared neighborhoods weren't actually blighted. Contemporary photographs show well-maintained buildings, active street life, functional commercial districts. The designation served to justify predetermined decisions rather than to describe actual conditions. Planners wanted the land. The people living on it were obstacles to be removed. This wasn't ancient history. Many displaced residents are still alive. The highways they built are the highways we drive on. The parks they created are the parks we visit. The consequences of these decisions shape contemporary urban geography. which neighborhoods have resources, which areas remain disconnected, why certain communities lack cohesion or institutional memory. The physical evidence of these neighborhoods was thoroughly removed, but traces remain, if you know where to look. The trees in Central Park are older than Central Park. Some of them were planted by the families who were evicted to create it. The trees survived when nothing else did. Silent witnesses to a community that was erased from history. Archaeological evidence of Seneca Village emerged during modern excavations. Foundations lie beneath park lawns, visible only when workers dig for utility lines or drainage systems. Archaeologists have recovered household objects, ceramics, tools, children's toys that document daily life in the vanished community. Property lines remain traceable in subtle elevation changes and vegetation patterns. The landscape was transformed but not completely obliterated. Evidence survived beneath the surface. Street patterns often preserve the footprints of demolished neighborhoods. When highways bisect communities, they typically follow existing streets to minimize property seizure complexity. Look at highway routes through urban centers, and you'll often see them tracking former neighborhood grids, curving slightly to follow old commercial streets, widening at intersections that no longer exist. The demolished buildings are gone. The street layout they defined remains encoded in the highway's path. Documentary evidence provides the most detailed reconstruction. Sanborn fire insurance maps recorded every building in American cities, drawn to support underwriting decisions. These maps documented structure dimensions, construction materials, building uses, property boundaries. They exist for thousands of communities and span decades of development. A researcher can trace individual buildings across map editions, watching neighborhoods grow, change, and sometimes vanish between updates. Census records preserve names, addresses, occupations, and family structures. Paired with Sanborn maps, census data populates the architectural footprint with actual people. You can identify who lived where, who their neighbors were, what they did for work. City directories add commercial information, which stores operated, which services were available, how the neighborhood functioned economically. Photographs document streetscapes that maps can only diagram. Collections in local archives, historical societies, and university libraries contain images of ordinary streets on ordinary days. These photographs show building facades, storefronts, street life, the visual texture of communities that no longer exist. Comparing photographs to maps to census data creates three-dimensional reconstructions of vanished neighborhoods. Recovery projects are ongoing. Archaeologists continue excavating Seneca Village, adding to our understanding of the community with each dig season. In Tulsa, researchers have mapped the original boundaries of the prosperous black district known as Black Wall Street, destroyed in the 1921 race massacre. Genealogists connect descendants with their family histories, tracing addresses and property ownership through archival records. The tools for this recovery are increasingly accessible. Historical maps are digitized and available online. Census records can be searched from home. Photograph collections have been scanned and indexed. The work requires time and patience, but no special credentials or permissions. Anyone interested in recovering these histories can participate. Physical traces can be recovered, but some erased communities left evidence that requires no excavation, because the people who remember them are still alive. There is a woman in Chicago who can describe every house on a street that hasn't existed since 1965. She can name every neighbor, tell you where they worked, explain why the block smelled like bread on Saturday mornings. The street exists now only in her memory and in the memories of the 60 other former residents she helped find. Living memory preserves what physical evidence cannot. When buildings are demolished, foundations can be excavated. When documents are destroyed, sometimes copies survive. But when communities are scattered, the texture of daily life, the relationships, the rituals, the small details that made a place distinctive, exists only in the minds of people who were there. Descendants and survivors of displacement have maintained these memories deliberately. Families kept photographs that official archives never collected. They saved documents, property deeds, eviction notices, letters that told their version of what happened. They told stories to their children, describing neighborhoods that no longer existed, naming people the children would never meet, explaining how things were before the highway came through. Some of these memories have been systematically collected. Oral history projects across the country have recorded interviews with people displaced by urban renewal. The recordings capture not just facts but voices, inflections, emotions. A woman describes watching the bulldozers arrive. A man explains how his father's business never recovered after forced relocation. A couple remembers the community meetings where they were told the demolition was inevitable, their neighborhood already condemned. Community museums operate outside traditional institutional frameworks to preserve these histories. They're often run by volunteers housed in small spaces, funded through community donations. They display photographs officials never archived, documents institutions never collected, artifacts families saved when everything else was lost. These museums exist because the people who remember refuse to let the erasure be complete. Digital projects have expanded the reach. Websites allow descendants to upload photographs, share stories, identify people and places in archival images. Former neighbors reconnect online after decades of separation, creating virtual communities that map onto neighborhoods that no longer physically exist. The Chicago woman who remembered every house on her vanished street used social media to find 60 other former residents. Together, they've reconstructed their neighborhood in unprecedented detail. The work is urgent. The generation that experienced mid-century urban renewal is aging. Each year, fewer people remain who can describe these neighborhoods from direct experience. Their memories are not replaceable. When they die, certain details die with them. The names of stores that appeared in no directory, the informal gathering places that left no records, the small kindnesses and conflicts that made the community real. Official memory and community memory sometimes tell different stories. Plaques commemorate the opening of highways without mentioning the neighborhoods destroyed to build them. Textbooks describe urban renewal as progress without documenting its human cost. Museum exhibits present architectural visions without interviewing people who were displaced to realize them. Communities are fighting to ensure their memories enter official records. They're demanding commemorative markers, pressuring textbook publishers, contributing to historical encyclopedias, testifying at hearings. They're insisting that their version of events, the lived experience, the losses, the trauma, becomes part of the permanent historical record. Living memory is precious but fleeting. The most lasting evidence of erased communities is often found in the most unexpected places. The documents hidden in archives that no one thought to check. The government agency that demolished a neighborhood took photographs of every house before they tore it down. Those photographs sat in a basement archive for 50 years, forgotten, until a descendant of a displaced family discovered them and began matching addresses to faces. This is the paradox of bureaucratic record keeping. The same institutions that erased communities also documented them meticulously. The documentation wasn't meant for historical preservation. It served legal and administrative purposes, but it survived. And now it serves as evidence for the very histories the institutions thought they were erasing. Property records document who owned what before the seizures. Deeds, tax records, and transfer documents preserve names and addresses. Court files contain testimony from property owners who contested their evictions, preserving their voices and their arguments in legal language. These records were never hidden. They were simply filed away in government archives, organized by legal procedure rather than historical significance, accessible but effectively invisible. Government photographers documented neighborhoods slated for demolition. They took systematic photographs for blight surveys, visual evidence used to justify clearance decisions. They photographed exteriors and interiors, capturing details that homeowners never thought to record. The photographs were meant to show decay and neglect, to support narratives about neighborhoods that needed to be removed. But they also documented homes, possessions, streetscapes, the physical reality of communities before destruction. Relocation agencies kept files on displaced families. The records tracked where people moved, what assistance they received, what happened to them after displacement. This data was collected for administrative purposes, not historical ones. but it maps the diaspora, showing how communities scattered, where residents ended up, which families stayed together, and which were separated. Planning documents contain the most comprehensive information. Architects' drawings show the neighborhoods before demolition. Proposals explain what was planned and what was ultimately built. Meeting minutes record debates and decisions. Budget documents account for every dollar spent on acquisition and clearance. These archives document not just what was destroyed, but why and how. The entire apparatus of erasure preserved in institutional files. Modern researchers are systematically mining these archives. They're digitizing photographs and creating searchable databases. They're georeferencing old maps onto current satellite imagery, allowing anyone to see what stood where demolished buildings once were. They're cross-referencing property records with census data, reconstructing who lived in which houses, which families were neighbors. The work has practical implications beyond academic interest. Descendants discover photographs of homes their grandparents described, but they never saw. They find property records proving family ownership, that family stories preserved but official histories ignored. They locate addresses, trace property through generations, document losses that were never officially acknowledged. Communities use these recovered archives to demand recognition. They present government photographs to city councils, demanding commemorative markers. They use planning documents to prove their neighborhoods were functional communities, not slums requiring clearance. They're taking the evidence that institutions used to justify destruction and repurposing it to demand remembrance. Archives preserve evidence of erasure. But the strangest traces of the past aren't in archives at all. They're in the inexplicable features of cities themselves. The geometry that doesn't make sense until you understand what it was designed to do. The width of your street was probably calculated by someone who wanted to make sure soldiers could march through your neighborhood. The angles of your intersections were designed to make sure no one could build a barricade. The shape of your city was drawn by people who were afraid of people like you. City layouts aren't accidents. The street you walk down every day, the plaza where you meet friends, the way buildings face each other, these emerged from deliberate decisions made by planners who had specific goals in mind. Sometimes those goals were practical, efficient land use, drainage, traffic flow. But often, the goals were about power and control. Consider two types of cities. Organic cities grew gradually over centuries. Their streets follow terrain, bend around obstacles, widen and narrow according to accumulated use. Medieval European cities developed this way, winding lanes that evolved from footpaths, irregular blocks shaped by property disputes and building expansions. These cities feel human-scaled because they developed through countless individual decisions, each responding to local needs. Planned cities are different. Someone drew them before they existed. A planner, often working for a king, an empire, or a development corporation, designed the geometry with specific purposes in mind. The grid, the radial, the meandering suburban layout, each serves distinct intentions. The grid suggests efficiency and equality. Every block identical, every lot the same size, property easily divided and sold. American cities adopted grids because they facilitated land speculation. Surveyors could divide territory without visiting it. Investors could buy plot sight unseen. Cities could expand indefinitely by extending the pattern. The grid appears democratic, no preferred locations, no hierarchical arrangement. But it also enables control through predictability. Every street connects to every other street. Nothing is hidden. Movement is visible. Radial designs concentrate power. Streets emanate from a central point, typically a palace, government building, or monument. The layout creates clear sightlines from the center outward. Wide boulevards radiating from power centers serve dual purposes. They're ceremonial, allowing impressive parades and demonstrations of authority. They're also military. Troops can move rapidly from the center to any part of the city. Cannons positioned centrally can fire down multiple streets. Baron Haussmann redesigned Paris with this principle in mind. Napoleon III wanted to prevent the kind of street barricades that had enabled previous revolutions. Haussmann demolished medieval neighborhoods and replaced them with wide, straight boulevards. Beautiful, certainly, but designed specifically to make popular uprisings more difficult. Narrow, winding streets favor defenders. Wide, straight boulevards favor soldiers and cavalry. Suburban layouts with curving streets and cul-de-sacs create a different effect. They appear organic, natural, picturesque, but they're carefully engineered to limit through traffic, isolate neighborhoods, and prevent the kind of street life that requires straight connective routes. The curves slow driving, discourage walking to adjacent neighborhoods, and create dependency on main arterial roads. The design shapes social interaction as deliberately as any grid. Understanding why your city is shaped the way it is reveals the priorities of those who designed it. Those priorities weren't usually about your convenience or your community. They were about efficiency, property values, military control, or social engineering. Basic urban design reflects social intentions, but some cities were designed with far more elaborate purposes that were meant to be invisible to ordinary inhabitants. Pierre L'Enfant designed Washington, D.C. to communicate power through geometry. The alignments are real, the symbols are real, the Masonic connections are documented. What is not real is almost everything you've read about it on the internet. L'Enfant's plan for the capital was explicitly symbolic from the beginning. He designed it to impress foreign dignitaries, to communicate the permanence and legitimacy of the new republic, to rival European capitals in grandeur. The layout incorporated classical references that educated observers would recognize: diagonal avenues mimicking the radiating streets of Versailles and Rome, open vistas emphasizing important buildings, geometric relationships between monuments that created visual and symbolic connections. The Masonic influences were never secret. George Washington was a Freemason. Many founding fathers belonged to lodges. Masonic symbolism drew from classical architecture and geometry, elements that were also foundational to Enlightenment design principles. L'Enfant used these shared visual languages openly. The cornerstone ceremonies for major buildings incorporated Masonic rituals performed publicly. This wasn't hidden knowledge. It was civic pageantry. But decades later, conspiracy theorists began projecting additional meanings onto the street layout. They claimed to find pentagrams, inverted crosses, occult symbols traced by streets and avenues. They drew lines between buildings and declared these alignments evidence of mystical energy channels. They interpreted every geometric relationship as proof of secret societies controlling the nation through urban design magic. Most of these claims don't withstand examination. The supposed pentagram requires ignoring half the streets in the area and exaggerating the significance of angles that don't actually align precisely. The inverted cross exists only if you selectively connect certain streets while disregarding the dozens of others that would disrupt the pattern. The mystical energy grid has no basis in documented design intentions and relies on retrofitting modern occult concepts onto 18th century planning. The real story is more interesting than the invented one. L'Enfant designed Washington to be legible as power. The Capitol building sits on a hill, visible from multiple points throughout the city. Wide avenues create ceremonial approaches to important buildings. Diagonal streets cutting through the grid generate dramatic vistas and focal points. The layout communicates hierarchy, permanence, and governmental authority through spatial relationships that anyone can experience without understanding their deliberate design. The symbolism was meant to work on multiple levels. Educated elites would recognize classical references and Masonic imagery. Ordinary citizens would experience the emotional impact, the sense of order, the visual impressiveness, the feeling that this capital represented something significant, without necessarily understanding the specific symbolic vocabulary. This is how deliberate urban symbolism actually works. It shapes experience and perception through geometry, sight lines, and spatial relationships. It doesn't require mystical energies or secret prophecies. It operates through documented design principles that architects and urban planners still use today. The conspiracy theories arise because people sense the intentionality in the design. The city does feel deliberately shaped. The alignments do seem meaningful. But instead of examining the documented historical purposes, which were about political legitimacy, classical republicanism, and aesthetic grandeur, conspiracy theorists invent elaborate hidden meanings that tell you more about contemporary anxieties than 18th century intentions. Cities can be deliberately symbolic without being mystically conspiratorial. Washington was designed to communicate specific messages about power, republicanism, and national identity. Those messages were successful. You can still feel them when you visit. Understanding the real symbolic vocabulary doesn't diminish the city's designed power. It reveals how that power was constructed. Washington's symbolism was explicit, but some urban designs were deliberately opaque, intended to shape behavior without inhabitants understanding why. A highway through your city wasn't just about moving cars. It was about moving certain people out and keeping other people from ever getting in. The route wasn't chosen for efficiency, it was chosen for segregation, and the evidence is in the planning documents, available to anyone who asks. Robert Moses shaped New York City infrastructure for decades. He built highways, bridges, parks, and housing projects that defined how millions of people moved through the city. His biographer documented a detail that Moses never publicly acknowledged. The bridges leading to Jones Beach were deliberately designed with low clearances, too low for buses to pass underneath. The beach was accessible by private car, but not by public transportation. Since car ownership correlated with race and class in mid-century New York, this design choice effectively restricted beach access without ever posting a sign that said certain people weren't welcome. Moses wasn't subtle about his other intentions. When planning highway routes through urban areas, he consistently chose paths that cut through Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods. His correspondence and planning documents show he viewed these communities as expendable. The Cross Bronx Expressway could have followed alternative routes with less residential displacement. Moses chose the route through densely populated neighborhoods, destroying community coherence and displacing thousands of families. The highway became a permanent scar, an infrastructure barrier that separated the South Bronx from the rest of the city. This pattern repeated nationwide. Highway planners across America routed interstates through Black neighborhoods with remarkable consistency. The decisions were documented in planning meetings where officials explicitly discussed removing blighted areas, a euphemism for neighborhoods they wanted to clear. The highways achieved multiple objectives. They provided car infrastructure for suburban commuters, they cleared urban land for redevelopment, and they created physical barriers between white and Black communities. Park design served similar purposes. Planners created separate entrances, different recreational facilities, physical layouts that channeled different populations into different areas. The separation wasn't achieved through explicit signage, but through design choices that made certain paths intuitive for some users and inconvenient for others. Playgrounds positioned near certain neighborhoods. Parking lots accessible from highways versus local streets. Amenities distributed unevenly across park space. These boundaries persist. The highways still run where they were built. The overpasses maintain their original clearances. The infrastructure continues to shape movement patterns long after its creators are dead and their explicit intentions forgotten. Residents experience the effects: limited mobility, neighborhood isolation, access restrictions, without necessarily understanding the deliberate choices that created these conditions. Subtler boundaries operate similarly. Railroad tracks define neighborhood edges in countless cities, creating physical and psychological divides between communities. The tracks were built for transportation, but they function as boundaries that few people cross casually. Zoning lines separate residential from industrial, single-family from multi-family, creating invisible borders that determine property values, school districts, and community composition. Public spaces can be designed to exclude without explicit prohibition. Benches with armrests prevent lying down. Lighting positioned to eliminate shadowy areas where homeless people might shelter. Skateboard deterrents on ledges and rails. These design choices, sometimes called hostile architecture, make spaces uncomfortable for certain users while remaining nominally public. The exclusion operates through discomfort rather than rules. These aren't conspiracies, they're documented planning decisions, recorded in meeting minutes, explained in professional journals, taught in planning schools. The evidence exists in archives, accessible to anyone interested in looking. The boundaries are invisible only because we've forgotten they were deliberately drawn. Invisible boundaries shape modern cities, but some of the most consequential boundaries were drawn long before highways existed. Lines on ancient maps that still determine where you live, where you worship, and where you're buried. The school your children attend may have been determined by a boundary drawn in 1147 to separate two sheep farms. The line was preserved as a parish boundary, then as a voting district, then as a school zone. The sheep are long gone. The boundary remains. Cities preserve their histories in geometry as much as in buildings. The shapes of neighborhoods, the curves of streets, the seemingly arbitrary divisions between districts. These encode decisions made by people who have been dead for centuries. The lines were drawn for specific purposes that no longer exist. But the lines persist, repurposed again and again, shaping contemporary life in ways no one consciously recognizes. Medieval field systems still determine London neighborhood boundaries. When land was divided among farmers in the Middle Ages, the plots followed terrain, running perpendicular to streams for drainage, following ridge lines to maximize usable acreage. Those property lines became parish boundaries when churches organized territory. Parish boundaries became civil administrative divisions. Civil divisions became voting districts and school catchment areas. The original agricultural logic is forgotten. The boundaries remain, determining which school your child attends, which representative you vote for, which services your neighborhood receives. Religious divisions from centuries ago still shape urban demographics in ways that seem inexplicable without historical context. A city will have a neighborhood that is predominantly one ethnicity or religion, separated from another neighborhood by a street that seems like any other street. But that street traces a parish boundary from the 1600s, marking where one church's jurisdiction ended and another's began. Immigrants arriving in the 19th century settled within their ethnic group's traditional parish boundaries. Their descendants stayed, or new arrivals from the same background moved in, preserving a pattern whose origin no one remembers. Political jurisdictions follow the same logic. A voting district has a strange jog that makes no sense given current population distribution or infrastructure. The jog follows a property line from when the area was farmland, preserved through successive rounds of redistricting, because changing it would require renegotiating agreements that are older than anyone involved. The boundary persists not because it serves any current purpose, but because altering it would be more complicated than maintaining it. This is boundary persistence, the tendency of lines once drawn to remain relevant far beyond their original context. The line served one purpose initially, that purpose disappeared. But the line had already been encoded into legal documents, maps, administrative systems. Removing it would require active effort. Maintaining it requires nothing, so it persists, getting repurposed for new functions, shape-shifting through history while its fundamental geometry remains unchanged. Understanding these ancient lines explains contemporary patterns that otherwise seem arbitrary. Why does one neighborhood have better services than another despite similar demographics? Follow the boundary back, and you might find it traces a medieval manor division. One side was always the poor side. Why does a street have an inexplicable name that doesn't match its surroundings? It marks an ancient boundary that was significant enough to be named. The geometry of your city encodes centuries of decisions. The shapes are data, the boundaries are historical records. Most people see only the present arrangement, but the past is there, written in lines that refuse to disappear. Ancient lines shape modern cities, but the most important hidden truth about our built environment isn't in the geometry, or the symbols, or the erased neighborhoods. It is in what all of this reveals about who we are, and why we see so little of what surrounds us. It is not your fault that you never noticed. The buildings, the streets, the monuments, they were designed to be invisible. The stories were buried deliberately. The languages were allowed to die. You weren't supposed to see, but now you can. Human perception is selective by necessity. Your brain processes millions of sensory inputs every second. If you consciously noticed everything, you'd be paralyzed by information overload. So your mind filters, it shows you what it thinks matters and hides the rest. You see what you expect to see, what you've been trained to recognize as significant. Everything else becomes background noise. This cognitive filtering serves you well in daily life, but it means you walk past historical evidence without recognizing it as evidence. You see a bricked-up window and register old building without asking why the window was sealed. You notice a street curve and think nothing of it because streets curve. Your brain categorizes these features as unremarkable and moves on. Temporal presentism compounds the problem. You assume the world has always been roughly as it is now. The park was always a park. The highway always ran through that neighborhood. The monument always stood in that square. This assumption makes sense. Your direct experience confirms it. But it is wrong. Almost everything around you was different 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. The present isn't the natural state. It is just the most recent state. Historical illiteracy prevents you from reading what is visible. The symbolic vocabulary of gravestones, the double meanings in architecture, the traces of erased communities, these require knowledge you were never taught. Schools don't generally train students to read landscapes as historical documents. Museums focus on artifacts in cases rather than evidence embedded in daily environments. You weren't given the tools to see these things, so you don't. Comfortable forgetting plays a role too. Some truths are easier not to know. The beautiful park has troubling origins. The beloved landmark was built through exploitation. The familiar neighborhood replaced one that was violently destroyed. Acknowledging these facts complicates your relationship with spaces you use and perhaps love. It is simpler to not ask questions, to accept official stories, to let the past remain vague and distant. But the invisibility isn't just your cognitive limitation. It was engineered. The erasure of certain histories wasn't passive neglect. It was active work. Neighborhoods were deliberately demolished and the records of their existence minimized. Monuments carry sanitized plaques that omit uncomfortable details. Street names were changed to obscure ethnic or political associations. Archives filed away documentation where it would be technically accessible, but practically invisible. Institutions benefit from historical amnesia. Tourism boards profit from comfortable heritage narratives. Property developers prefer neighborhoods without complicated histories. Politicians find it convenient when past injustices are forgotten. The unseeing isn't a failure of individual awareness. It is a predictable outcome of systems that have incentives to make certain truths invisible. Understanding why we miss what we miss doesn't eliminate the problem, but it changes your relationship with your environment. You start to see the filtering happening. You notice when official stories feel incomplete. You recognize the signs of deliberate erasure. You understand that the landscape around you is full of evidence you weren't trained to read, but that you can learn. Understanding why we miss things is necessary, but it is not sufficient. The real question is, what do we do now? You don't need special equipment or academic training. You need this: the willingness to stop, to look up, to wonder why is that there. The skills you've learned in the last 2 hours will work tomorrow, on your street, in your city. The hidden world is waiting for you to notice it. Start with buildings. Walk down a familiar street, but this time look up. Really look. Notice the architectural details above the first floor that you've never paid attention to. Look for ghost signs, faded painted advertisements on brick walls. Check for bricked-up windows and doorways. Ask yourself why they're there. Look at corners where one building style abruptly changes to another. That line often marks where an older structure was demolished and replaced. Examine foundations that don't match the building above them. Notice mason's marks if you're looking at very old stonework. Each detail tells a story about how the building changed over time. Visit a cemetery with a guidebook to gravestone symbols. Your local historical society probably has one, or you can find symbol dictionaries online. Walk slowly. Look for patterns in death dates, clusters that indicate epidemics or disasters. Notice the different sections and how they're organized. Look for the areas with smaller, simpler stones that mark the graves of people with less wealth or status. Pay attention to what is missing, the gaps, the unmarked areas, the sections that seem forgotten. Read epitaphs not just for sentiment, but for information about how people lived and died. Study street patterns. Find a historical map of your area. Many are digitized and available through local libraries or online archives. Compare it to current street layouts using satellite view on your phone. Look for streets that curve inexplicably. Notice where highways cut through neighborhoods and what used to be there. Pay attention to street names and research their origins. Notice boundaries where railroad tracks divide neighborhoods, where property sizes suddenly change, where architectural styles shift. These boundaries usually mean something. Research doesn't require institutional access. Start with what is freely available. Historical maps, digitized photographs, census records, newspaper archives. Much of this material is online now. Visit your local historical society or library. Talk to long-time residents, especially older people who remember when things were different. Record their stories if they're willing. Upload old family photographs to community history projects. Contribute what you know. The key is developing the habit of noticing. When you see something odd, a street that doesn't quite make sense, a building that seems out of place, a monument in an unexpected location, stop and wonder about it. Take a photograph. Look it up later. Most questions about local history have answers. Someone documented it, mapped it, photographed it, or remembered it. The information exists. You just have to look. These skills are portable. The vocabulary you've learned works everywhere. Ghost signs exist in every city with old brick buildings. Cemetery symbolism varies by tradition, but follows recognizable patterns. Street geometries reveal planning intentions, whether you're in Paris or Portland. Erased communities left traces in New York, London, Tokyo, and every other city that grew by destroying what was there before. The change isn't about acquiring expert knowledge. It is about adjusting how you move through the world. Instead of seeing your environment as static background, you start seeing it as a layered document. Every walk becomes an opportunity to read. Every building becomes a potential source of information. Every odd detail becomes a question worth investigating. Tools help you see, but seeing brings responsibilities and raises questions about what we should do with what we discover. Uncovering the past is not innocent. When you find a buried graveyard, real descendants exist. When you name an atrocity, real communities have to decide how to respond. Seeing is a choice. Telling is a responsibility. You don't get to look away once you've seen. Not all revelations are welcome. Genealogical research has connected descendants of enslaved people with documentation of their ancestors, but that documentation often comes from slave sale records, estate inventories that list human beings as property, punishment logs. The information answers questions families have held for generations. It also confronts them with the brutal specifics of how their ancestors were treated. Some descendants want this knowledge. Others find it re-traumatizing. The uncovering is not inherently good or bad. It depends on context, consent, and how the information is handled. Communities sometimes disagree about whether painful histories should be commemorated or allowed to fade. A researcher discovers the location of a lynching site and advocates for a memorial. Some community members, particularly descendants of victims, support recognition. Others, including some black residents, worry that commemoration will reopen wounds or attract unwanted attention. Still others, often white residents, resist acknowledgement altogether. There is no simple resolution. Every choice has consequences. Discovery can trigger gentrification. A neighborhood with a hidden history of cultural significance gets rediscovered by journalists, historians, or artists. Property values rise. Longtime residents get displaced. The community that maintained memory through generations of neglect gets pushed out just as wider recognition arrives. The uncovering contributes to erasure, a different kind of erasure, but erasure nonetheless. These complications don't mean we should stop looking, they mean we have to look thoughtfully. If you discover human remains, treat them with the respect you'd want for your own ancestors. If you uncover family histories, consider whether and how to share them. Who has the right to know? Who might be harmed by knowing? If you identify sites of atrocity or suffering, engage with descendant communities before deciding how to publicize your findings. Their stories belong to them, not to you. The positive potential is real. Truth enables reconciliation. Documentation supports justice claims. Recognition honors those who were deliberately forgotten. Communities gain power when their histories are acknowledged in official records rather than persisting only in oral tradition. Descendants find missing pieces of their family stories. These outcomes matter, but they require care. The difference between responsible uncovering and exploitative revelation often comes down to intention and method. Are you uncovering history to satisfy curiosity or to serve the people whose history it is? Are you treating human pain as entertainment or as something deserving respect? Are you centering your own discovery or the communities who maintained memory when no one else cared? You're now a participant in this process. The documentary taught you to see what is hidden. That knowledge creates obligations. When you notice unmarked graves, erased neighborhoods, sanitized monuments, you have choices about what to do with that awareness. Ignore it. Research it privately. Share it publicly. Each choice has implications. Seeing is a choice. But once you've seen, you can't claim ignorance. The hidden histories become your responsibility too. Not to fix everything. Not to be the hero of someone else's story, but to engage thoughtfully with what you've discovered and to consider whose interests you serve when you decide what to do with it. Ethics complicate seeing, but they don't diminish its value. Because the alternative, remaining blind, has consequences too. Tomorrow morning, you'll walk the same route you've walked 1,000 times, but this time everything will be different. Not because anything changed, but because you did. The invisible world is about to become visible, and once you see it, you'll never be able to unsee it again. The same buildings will stand where they've always stood. But now, you'll notice the ghost sign fading on the brick wall, an advertisement for a business that closed before your parents were born, painted by a hand that has been dead for decades. You'll see the bricked-up doorway on the second floor and understand it once opened onto a bridge, a connection that was severed when the adjacent building was demolished. You'll look at the street curve and recognize the footprint of something that used to stand there, an obstacle that vanished but left its shape embedded in the urban fabric. The street names will be the same names you've always seen, but now you'll read them as political decisions, as markers of who held power when those names were chosen. You'll notice which names appear and which are conspicuously absent. You'll recognize the patterns, the clusters of presidential names, the commemoration of wars, the indigenous names marking territories where those peoples no longer live. The monuments will stand where they've always stood. But you'll understand that someone decided what they would commemorate and what they would omit. You'll see the careful language on the plaques, the stories they tell and the stories they bury. You'll recognize the dates when they were erected as clues to what the society of that moment wanted to remember and what it wanted to forget. The cemetery you drive past will no longer be just a place of the dead. It will be an archive preserving social history in stone. You'll read the symbols, date the stones by their typography. Notice the clusters of deaths that mark epidemics and disasters. You'll see the gaps, the unmarked sections, the silences that speak as loudly as monuments. The empty lot, the parking garage, the park. These spaces will carry the weight of what they replaced. You'll see the negative spaces, the traces of buildings that once stood there, the communities that were scattered. You'll understand that the present landscape is just one layer in a palimpsest, that other versions existed before, and their ghosts remain visible if you know how to look. This seeing isn't a burden, it is a gift. The world becomes more interesting, more layered, more alive with story. Every walk is an opportunity to read. Every detail becomes a question worth investigating. The ordinary becomes extraordinary when you understand how much history it carries. You won't see everything. The filtering will continue. Your brain will still protect you from information overload. But you'll notice more, you'll wonder more, you'll understand that the landscape around you is a document written by generations of human decisions, each layer adding to the previous ones, each era leaving its mark. The hidden world has been there all along. It's surrounded you every day of your life. You just didn't know the language. Now you do. Tomorrow morning, take your usual route, but this time, look up. Look at the buildings, the signs, the scars. Look down at the pavement, the stones, the boundaries. Look around at the curves, the gaps, the shapes of absence. The world you thought you knew is about to reveal itself as something far more complex, far more layered, far more alive with forgotten stories you learned to see. Now go look.